This strikes at the heart of everything that we hold dear. This senseless tragedy has shaken our entire state to the core.
Because the White House says they want to hire more agents, they want to do all sorts of things, and you are standing in the way in the House.
That's nonsense. It's absolute nonsense. They have to solve the crisis here, and throwing more money at the broken system will not do that.
We are focused here on solutions. I lead a department of 260,000 incredibly talented public servants. I don't have time for politics.
Hello, I'm Robert Costa in Washington. Welcome to America Decides. As authorities say, one person was killed in a shooting inside a high school in Perry, Iowa earlier today. 5 other people were injured. Officials say the suspected shooter was a 17-year-old student at the school and took his own life. The incident happened on the first day of classes resuming after winter break before school started. CBS News senior White House and political correspondent Ed O'Keefe has been on the ground all day reporting on this story. Ed, thanks for being here and for all of your reporting. Difficult story. What's the latest?
Bob, at this hour, local authorities tell us one 6th grader is dead inside the high school. This is one of those school systems that joins its middle school and high school with the elementary school just down the street. And it was a morning breakfast program where at 7:37 a.m. the shots rang out. They identified the 17-year-old shooter as someone who was carrying 2 weapons and an improvised explosive device. The improvised explosive device was disarmed by authorities after they arrived. More than 100 local, state, and federal police responded into this tiny town of 8,000. It's about 40 miles northwest of Des Moines. And of course, this state has been at the center of the political universe for much of the last year and will be in the coming days, which is what drew so much extra attention to this incredible small-town tragedy. And a reminder that even 4 days into the new year, this is already the 2nd school shooting in the country at the beginning of a year that very well could see many more.
I know, Ed, you'll be on CBS Evening News talking through this, and you've been on so many platforms today talking about your reporting. But what is the talk among those on the ground there outside of the school in terms of what they would like to see happen? Of course, they're still grappling with the tragedy, but is there anything they're talking about in terms of policy or action that needs to be done in the wake of this horrific shooting?
Yeah, you know, I think it's a good reminder for those of us who cover policy and cover these things at the 40,000-foot level to have to witness and report some of this, because the reaction so far today has been sort of that classic, and we see this every time, kind of, I can't believe it would happen here, kind of shock. These students were either en route to school or not even there yet, and turned right around and told they don't have school tomorrow, won't be back until Monday now at the earliest. And they were coming back from holiday break, and they were just in shock. We saw and talked with some who were here back around the school again this afternoon, who aren't talking about gun control or about, you know, metal barriers at their front doors at the school, but are more concerned about, you know, how is it that a parent either has these weapons in the house and has them easily accessible enough to their children who aren't yet 18, or, you know, did the parent even know, and should they have allowed their 17-year-old to have them or to have access to them at all? And so I think it's more about that sort of element of it, at least so far. But look, this is Iowa. They know it's the January of a quadrennial year, and that inevitably it's going to become part of a broader conversation across the state. We asked Iowa's Republican governor, Kim Reynolds, who is a supporter of the Florida governor, Ron DeSantis, who's running. I asked her, I said, look, you know the eyes of the world are on the Hawkeye State in the next 10, 11 days. How should the presidential candidates talk about this? And she said, look, that's up to them to decide. We're going to focus on the state's response to this and how this community heals. And, you know, we'll see in the coming days how DeSantis, Nikki Haley, Donald Trump, and others are confronted with this. And it just so happened, Vivek Ramaswamy was here for a previously scheduled event this morning in Perry. Turned it into more of a small conversation with the small crowd that was there. Didn't really focus on solutions, but instead was just an opportunity for members of the community shell-shocked by what happened to discuss it with somebody who's seeking the White House.
This all brings back memories for me, Ed, as a reporter in 2015 with the shooting in Charleston at Mother Emanuel AME. President Biden will be visiting there. on Monday. I was down in South Carolina covering the presidential campaign, and like you went to Perry
you were
today.
there. I remember you were there. Yeah, you were there, and I was here in Iowa. And I remember that night thinking, here we go again, gun violence injecting itself into the presidential campaign. And sure enough, for a day or two, it dominated the discourse. And then they moved on to the next issue. And you're right, to your point, not to interrupt, but I vividly thought of that today, Bob, because I remember you had gone to South Carolina. I'd come here to Iowa to see Jeb Bush. And it happened across the street from the hotel that most reporters were staying in there in Charleston. So it's happened before. And that one was a far deadlier incident. This one is just so tragic, given that it's children yet again. But again, happens on the sidelines of a presidential campaign.
It's happened before. What a afraid we have in this country about violence and guns and schools. President Biden will be going to Mother Emanuel on Monday, as I mentioned. What has been the response, Ed, your usual beat, the White House covering President Biden? What has been the response from the president, from the administration about this shooting, this deadly shooting in Iowa at another school in America, and from the Republican candidates, including Nikki Haley? Speaking of 2015, she was the governor of South Carolina at that time. Now she's running for the Republican nomination.
So at the White House, Bob, we know the president had been briefed, the attorney general was briefed, and we heard here that the mayor of Perry, Iowa, had been contacted by the White House with them trying to get the mayor's number so that the president or others at the White House could call. Remember, there's now an Office of Gun Violence Prevention that's part of the West Wing operation that is designed to, if not deploy here, at least reach out and offer federal assistance and help. But repeatedly in the White House briefing, the question was asked by the press secretary, when will enough be enough? That is the focus Democrats will have on this. I'll be curious to see what Republicans have to say in the coming days.
Ed O'Keefe covering a tough story with excellence as ever. Ed O'Keefe, thank you, and wish you the best with the continuing of all this reporting on this story. Meanwhile, the battle over how to approach border security continues here in Washington. House Speaker Mike Johnson led a trip of Republican lawmakers to the border yesterday, calling for immigration policy changes. President Biden wants Congress to pass more funding to address the issue. And attempted border crossings have now reached an all-time high. That was in December. So CBS News immigration and politics reporter Camilo Montoya Galvez joins us now. Camilo, you've been at the border tracking all of this. Is the Speaker's visit something that is going to lead to some kind of breakthrough in the negotiations between House Republicans and the administration, or is it more political positioning?
Well, look, Bob, U.S. border officials processed more than 300,000 migrants in December alone. That is an all-time high that really underscores the magnitude of the escalating crisis here along the U.S.-Mexico border. But back in Washington, D.C., as you know, the executive and legislative branches cannot seem to agree on how to address this incredibly vexing and pressing issue for the country in general. The House Speaker and other Republicans are saying that they will not approve any additional border funding unless that is accompanied, Bob, by far-reaching changes to the country's immigration laws. Meanwhile, the White House is saying that they need urgently funding to hire additional immigration judges, asylum officers, Border Patrol agents, and to expand deportation flights as well as legal immigration programs to divert migrants away from the U.S.-Mexico border. Republicans are demanding sweeping restrictions on asylum as well as new powers to just turn people back across the Rio Grande behind me without processing their asylum claims. And so there is a lot of inconsistency here as to how the Biden administration and Congress want to deal with this incredibly complex issue. But here, communities on the ground and residents here feel that they desperately need support from the federal government. And while the executive and legislative branches continue to fight over this issue, the communities here are bracing, Bob, for another crisis.
What's the situation for the people who are coming across the border? I've seen images, and so many of them are carrying young children in their arms. What is it like for them once they come to the United States? What is the reception for them in terms of lodging, health care, food?
I mean, Bob, 100,000 of the 250,000 migrants who entered U.S. border custody in December were parents and children traveling together. Another 12,000 were unaccompanied minors. These are very vulnerable populations that pose unique challenges for the government and communities here because of the vulnerability of migrants and children, but also legal limits on detaining minors. And there's only one shelter here in Eagle Pass for these migrants, Bob, and they are completely oversaturated and overwhelmed. They told us that this is not a good system for the country, for the government, and also for the migrants because they end up in this years-long legal limbo, including migrants who may not have strong asylum claims, but, Bob, who are being released simply because of the fact that the U.S. cannot deport large numbers of people to countries like Venezuela, for example, because of the strained diplomatic relations with that country. And so this is an incredibly complex problem, but as lawmakers argue over it, it is very important, Bob, I think, to not lose sight of the fact that this is mainly being felt by communities here along the U.S.-Mexico border. Small towns like Eagle Pass, Texas, Lukeville, Arizona, Jacumba Hot Springs, California. These are towns that are very small and that don't have the resources and the infrastructure to process thousands of migrants each day.
Camila Montoya Galvez, thank you. We're just 11 days away from the Iowa caucuses. We'll discuss the latest in the 2024 presidential race. That's coming up next. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back. This Saturday marks 3 years since the deadly January 6 assault on the U.S. Capitol. And in a new campaign ad, President Biden is spotlighting the violence from that day and from tragedies like the white supremacist rally in Charlottesville.
There's something dangerous happening in America. There's an extremist movement that does not share the basic beliefs in our democracy. All of us are being asked right now, what will we do to maintain our democracy? History's watching. The world is watching. And most important, our children and grandchildren will hold us responsible.
CBS News Chief Washington Correspondent Major Garrett joins us now here at the table. Major, what's your assessment of President Biden deciding to move in this direction with this ad?
What's interesting, Robert, is last year, when the economic statistics were not as favorable as they currently are, the Biden re-election campaign leaned heavily into Biden economics. They've sort of dropped that or receded that, even though economic numbers are far better. Inflation's down, stock market is up, unemployment remains low, but they're not leaning into economics at all, at least not right now. What are they leaning into? Something they consider more central to the future of the country, not your economic future, but the entire foundation of our democracy and our approach to rule of law. That is where the Biden-Harris re-election campaign wants to start 2024, assuming Trump will be the nominee and framing everything about the race between Biden and Trump as a question of, will this American experiment continue as we have known it? Because they are asserting if there is a Trump re-election, it will not.
And it's not just going to be advertising. January 6th remained this open wound in the country, and especially on the political front. Trump still faces a federal trial that is scheduled to begin sometime in the late winter or spring, led by Special Counsel Jack Smith. How is that going to overlap with the political messaging from the White House?
I think the interesting thing for the Biden-Harris re-election campaign is they've made a tactical decision not to leave that to the legal forum only, to make this a political argument and start it right as soon as possible. The president will be in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania tomorrow to give a speech about all these things we just discussed, a day before January 6th, for weather reasons primarily, but to say, look, we are 3 years removed from this event, which on the Republican side is now being cast as something that was not as grave, not as dangerous, not as troublesome as it clearly was. What the Biden-Harris re-election campaign wants to say, Democrats, rally around this, and all you suburban, undecided, or swing voters and exurban swing voters who tilted the election in 2020 toward Joe Biden, think about this. Remember that day. Remember what led up to it. Remember what has happened since then. And remember that Trump has said if he's reelected, he'll pardon most, if not all, of those offenders on that day and essentially tell America for all terms and times it was no big deal. When most of us believe not only was it a big deal, it was a central moment in whether this understanding, historic understanding of a peaceful transfer of power and basic orientations to democracy can or cannot hold.
you used the phrase, it was a central moment. And I think of FDR and December 7th, 1941, talking about that day to the U.S. Congress and to the American people, a day that everybody in the country seemed to believe would live in infamy. Mm-hmm. There is a divide over January 6th that you've mentioned. With the benefit of distance now from January 6th, a few years, what does January 6th mean to the country based on your reporting on all of these issues?
It's a jump ball in ways I simply did not imagine it could be, Robert. For a good number of Trump-aligned Republicans, it's a much smaller event, not violent, even though the visual images are unmistakably violent. It wasn't as violent, or it might have been a, quote, inside job, which it manifestly was not. There has been an attempt, a successful attempt within Republican circles generally, and certainly those most Trump-aligned, to not only sanitize January 6th, but to practically eliminate it from the national memory as something traumatic, as something maybe pseudo-patriotic, that they were onto something. That's not what happened. That's not what it was about. The monstrous lie will always be a monstrous lie. 2020 was not an election that was stolen. There did not need to be any kind of violent riot at the Capitol to stop a peaceful transfer of power, yet it happened. And for Republicans, that's becoming sort of a misty memory. And what the Biden-Harris reelection campaign says, no, it's not misty. It is real, it is ever present, and if the person who was mostly responsible for setting all that in motion is brought back to the presidency, we have no idea what direction things will go.
Major Garrett, thank you.
Thanks.
House Democrats say former President Trump's businesses got millions in foreign payments while he was in the White House. Next, we'll ask our Congressional Panel for their reaction. You're streaming America Decides. Welcome back to America Decides. Our Congressional Panel is here. Nicole Killian and Andrew Desiderio, they join us. Nicole is a CBS News congressional correspondent. Andrew is a senior congressional correspondent for Punchbowl News. Great to have you both here. We've been following this congressional report on former President Donald Trump and how foreign countries, when they were in Washington or in the United States, spent money on Trump properties. Tell us, what is this report and what's in it?
So this is a new staff report from the House Oversight Committee Democrats. And basically, this culminates a years-long investigation, about 7 years to be more precise, that found that the former president received some $7.8 million from a variety of foreign governments, from China, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and others. In fact, they say much of that money came from China, some $5.5 million money that went to, for instance, some of the former president's properties, the Trump Hotel here in Washington, in Las Vegas, and other venues. And they say that this is just a snapshot of the amount of money that potentially the former president received, that this potentially was a violation of the Foreign Emoluments Clause in the Constitution, which bars a leader like the president from receiving foreign payments. So in terms of these findings, the main objective of committee Democrats is they simply want to see legislative reforms behind this, but they do feel that the former president was in violation of this clause.
Andrew, you track congressional leadership, especially the Republicans who run the House of Representatives. Will they follow up on any of these reports' findings and policy recommendations?
I'd say it's highly unlikely, and I think a lot of this stems from what House Democrats did when they were in the majority under the Trump presidency, right? When they led all of these investigations into the former president. Emoluments was a big issue for their investigation of corruption allegations into the former president, the then president at the time. And part of this is also aimed at combating some of these allegations that Republicans are making, similar allegations about President Biden as part of their impeachment inquiry into the current president. So I'd say it's definitely highly unlikely that Republicans will follow up on this specific line of questioning here, and I think it's more some posturing by both sides.
So maybe not some follow-up, but it's an intriguing report to see all of that compiled, all of that data, all of that information. I would like to get both of your takes on Speaker Mike Johnson and his trip to the border. Is that going to jumpstart talks about border security and maybe a deal on Ukraine and Israel as well and government funding? or is this more of a standoff? Nicole?
I was going to say, in a perfect world, yes to your initial question, but I think the reality is the sides still are very far apart. And I think a key reason for that is that Speaker Johnson isn't even at the table. He told our Margaret Brennan that he's not even really read in on this process. We have seen these border negotiations primarily being handled by Secretary Mayorkas and between Senate Democrats and Republicans. And we also know that Speaker Johnson really used that opportunity to hammer home the importance in House Republicans' view to push H.R. 2, which is the hardline immigration bill that they passed last year. But that is a non-starter for Democrats, particularly not only in the House, but also in the Senate. It's a non-starter as far as these negotiations are concerned. So it really begs the question, how can the ball be moved forward if both sides seem to be talking past each other?
You agree with that, or?
Yeah, I think, going to the border was largely a political exercise. He's trying to highlight the issue and make sure that, the Senate negotiators know that the House isn't just going to rubber stamp whatever the Senate and the White House come up with, if they come up with anything. This week, what the negotiators on the Senate side have been saying is that they hope to have some sort of framework, something to be able to read out to senators when they do return to Washington next week. But that is far from certain at this point. And Speaker Johnson is maintaining the hard line that it has to be H.R. 2 or nothing. H.R. 2, of course, that House Republican border security bill, non-starter for Democrats, non-starter for the White House. So basically, you have this situation where the Senate and the White House are working toward a bipartisan product, trying to get 60 votes in the Senate, something that can get the president's signature, whereas the House is focused on a more partisan path here that really, if you're trying to get something done to resolve the issue, will not get a result.
And very quickly, Andrew, do you believe Secretary Mayorkas, the DHS secretary, will be impeached by House Republicans, based on your reporting?
It seems like they're on track to do that. They're going to start having hearings on this. It's kind of like, the idea of putting the toothpaste back in the tube. Once you start the process, you can't really stop it. And Republicans are really furious with the Homeland Security Secretary over the conditions at the southern border. Personally, I don't see a scenario in which they just pump the brakes on that impeachment effort. Obviously, this would be kicked over to the Senate, and the Senate would likely dispose of it very quickly.
Nicole, what are your thoughts on that? But as well, also, we began the show talking about this horrific shooting in Iowa. Are there any discussions about gun control among your sources on Capitol Hill?
Oh, well, just quickly, with respect to the issue of Secretary Mayorkas, of course, he tried to play down these impeachment proceedings that are expected to start next week in the House Homeland Security Committee, saying, he's not really going to focus on the politics and political rhetoric, but really wants to kind of focus on these border negotiations. I mean, gun control, look, this is an issue that we time and again after each major mass shooting or incidents like what we saw in Iowa, there are all these drum beats for more around the issue of gun control. But again, I think given the dynamics that we just discussed, not only on immigration, but whether it's government funding, whether it's now gun control, it's very hard to see much movement on this issue beyond just, talking points about the need to do something.
Yeah, I mean, 2 years ago, you had the Safer Communities Act, which was a fairly major bipartisan undertaking on gun reform in the context of the fact that Congress doesn't usually take bipartisan action on this issue and has failed to really over many, many decades. The conditions for that, the political conditions for that were ripe because you had a Democratic House, you had a Democratic Senate, and of course, a Democratic president as well. And in the Senate, where you need 60 votes to get anything done, you had a lot of Republicans that were willing to negotiate and work together to try to get something done. So the political conditions, the landscape was favorable for something like that. Right now, the conditions are simply unfavorable.
Highly unlikely, it seems, in almost everything. Highly unlikely. Nicole Killian, Andrew Desiderio, thank you so much for being here. That does it for today. You're streaming CBS News.